Yo. So today, at some point, what was that?
It makes zero sense as to why it's not going.
Oh. Why has it got that reverb echo on it?
Couldn't tell you.
Do you have another window open with this video?
No.
Right here we can saw how the feedback would come from.
So, no, I do. I mean, I guess we'll just run with it because. Yeah, we'll run with it. It won't sound the best on the stream, but it's recording better.
All right. That's fine by me. Take it from the top?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome back. So today we're doing part 2 of a series on allergy and autoimmune disease, insights and uncommon knowledge. Last time in our part 1, we laid the groundwork for how the immune system works. If you didn't see that video, we're going to cover briefly the content of that. We're going to touch on it in about 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20, depending on how long it takes. And then we're going to jump into new information. This is a series we're going to keep building on previous information. So if you see anything in here that you'd like a further explanation on, by all means, go back and watch that other video. If you see it, it makes sense, and you want to get on to the next stuff, certainly just pick up where you're at, and you should be able to build forward from there. All right, here we go. So this is a functional map of your immune system as it relates to drug or chemical-induced autoimmunity. And this is a good picture, but I like this one better. Boom. All right. So here we have a bunch of information, language about how something toxic causes aberrant cell death or tissue injury, causes cell death and a self-antigen to be released. Then it goes to all these other things. But really, these are just circles and blobs. And maybe if you were in immunology, you would already understand this. But we're going to start off with the basis that nobody really is in that. And if you are, then just buckle up. Here we go. So what I did is I went through and I remapped all this stuff. So toxicant, if you notice, poison. Poison hits the cells. What is the cell? It's a piñata. It's got a membrane on the outside. It's got stuff in the middle. And when you whack it, it bursts open and it sends stuff into the general environment. Now, you could whack it open by dissolving it with the poison, by poisoning it, or by hitting it with the hammer. Up here we have Mr. Wacky Face, our resident hammer. If you hit the piñata, it opens up, lets things go. This cell, the dendrite cell, has a toll-like receptor on it. That means if you've ever paid a toll, you know that it's a cost to get into where you want to go. So it's like a lock and key. So the stuff busts out of the cell. This dendritic cell sees that and then takes this meditating cell, this super chill, relaxed immune system cell, and then turns, boom, into warrior cell. That's activated. That's a CD4 plus T cell. That warrior cell goes and talks to this cell, which is the photographer. This is the one that has recognition, takes pictures, sends them over to the plasma cell, the mailman cell, takes the pictures, which are the information stored as autoantibodies. That's the mugshot that then tells the immune complex basically about the crime scene. Then the crime scene basically reinforms the dendritic cell, and then that whole process cycles again and again. So this basically here is the immune complex. This is the thing that tells the body what's going on. This is the information that is derived. Now, what's interesting is this immune complex is part of what activates cell destruction, which is tissue injury, which goes over here to our friend Mr. Wacky Face, goes over here, hits the piñata again, breaks open more cells. Aberrant, that means abnormal cell death. It's a release of self-antigen. So when you break this thing open, there's going to be stuff spilling out everywhere that dumps into the system. But what it also does is it goes over here, these nod-like receptors. These receptors are just signal flares. See this right here is a flare. It lets everybody know that there's something going wrong, and that activates these sirens. Here you have a siren. Here you have a siren, siren, all their siren. And these are the names of the chemicals that get spread throughout the body, which then increase inflammation. If you're familiar at all with inflammation, you know that that is one of the driving forces of all kinds of allergies and autoimmunities. The more inflammation there is, the more of these sirens are going off. And it's really designed, that inflammation is designed to highlight an area. Well, what happens if you have systemic inflammation? It highlights everything. It's sort of like when I was doing algebra, they're like, I will highlight what's important. So I just highlighted the whole book, and then I just had a green book. And that didn't really help me learn it at all. Anyway, interesting thing is all that inflammation reactivates these CD4 plus T cells, and then they go through that whole loop. Do you know why ants don't get sick? Because they're little antibodies. Bad jokes, plenty of them. Okay, so let's ask this question. What things can cause aberrant cell death if that's the main initiating event? Because this is like when you have cell death is when you have tissue damage, and that could be brain, eyes, liver, kidneys, heart, reproductive system, skin. Anything that an autoimmune disease will attack is the cells dying and then your body trying to rebuild them. So what can cause that? Let's go over here to this list of toxicants. Plastics, mold, lipopolysaccharides. We'll talk about that in a minute. Pharmaceuticals, alcohol. Yep. Metals, heavy metals. Air, water, and soil pollutants, mineral oil, rapeseed oil. So mineral oil is found in a lot of food and sometimes in the pharmaceutical industry. So all of those are toxicants. They cause toxic cell damage. Then that cell dies when it shouldn't. Tissue damage over here. Mr. Wacky Face, our Representative Hammer. Also, car crash. We have a talk on whiplash that is also available on the channel. You should definitely check that out if you've been involved in that. There's a whole bunch of problems that happen because of it, but it's all initiated with tissue injury, then aberrant cell death. Broken bones, torn ligaments, repetitive injury or overtraining. This is my marathoners and triathletes. Surgery. Surgery is a life-saving injury. So surgery done properly will save your life, but that's to say that it's not the end of the story. There's things that has to be done to clean up after that, and especially the type of surgery. We'll talk about one specific type of surgery that will increase risk of allergies and autoimmunities developing. Also, concussion. Concussion is just tissue injury inside the brain. Now you can imagine if you have brain cells that die when they're not supposed to and it causes an inflammation, that can cause lots of problems. Now, here's where we get into the other stuff in the category labeled other. Overeating, malnutrition. Well, wait a minute. Can you have both of those at the same time? Sure. Can you eat 5,000 calories worth of Doritos? Absolutely. No offense to Doritos. Your product is delicious. It's not very nutritious, though. Same is said to be true about a bunch of other foods. You can eat a bunch of empty, hollow foods, especially fast foods, things that are nutrient deficient. You can definitely eat too many of them and get not a lot of nutrition from it. The correction for that is pretty simple. You just eat less and get more nutrition. Surprisingly, when you get the right amount of nutrition, you don't feel as hungry. All right, so since we're on the topic of eating, prolonged eating period. If you eat all day long, your body is not a compost pile. Don't treat it as such. Indigestion. If you eat but don't digest well, then that could cause problems, and we'll talk about that as we go through. Electrosmog. Everybody knows what smog is. Those are air pollutants. Electrosmog is pollution of the air waves. Those are things like cell phone towers, and we have equivocal proof to show that it is absolutely impacted in the cells. Poor sleep, chronic stress, PTSD. So these are some psychological issues. These cause chemical cascades and inflammation throughout the body, and that can cause your cells to break down, and they release the self-antigen. Now, the self-antigen is the thing that tells your immune system. The self-antigen is the thing that tells your immune system to go out and start attacking things. The problem is it's trying to attack things that are you. Stop hitting yourself. Okay, here we go. Here's an important slide. We talked about this. If you have aberrant cell death, release of the stuff, some cells notice, they take these resting cells, activate them, and they go on this process. But this cell right here, it starts attacking things like the spleen, intraepithelial lymphocytes, and Th17 is released. Let's look. Spleen, it's a big part of the lymphatic system. If you notice right here in this special highlighting where it says dendritic cells, It stores more than 50% of the cells that become macrophages and dendritic cells. Macrophages are the cells that go around and gobble up all the extra garbage. They're what attack the foreign invaders, all the aberrant proteins. Dendritic cells, we saw that those are part of the process, and if your body releases Th17 and starts attacking your spleen, you're also going to mess up those cells that are designed to clean you up. So this is relatively important. One other thing I'm going to touch on before we move on, right down here, it produces antibodies. So you see how inflaming your spleen that produces antibodies could cause some pretty significant issues. Yeah, it also fights bacteria that cause pneumonia and meningitis. So spleen, important. Th17 attacks it. Epithelium, where is it? Well, pretty much anywhere that you've experienced in autoimmune disease. Lining the blood vessels, organs, and skin. What does it do? It exchanges oxygen and CO2. It helps to absorb nutrients and eliminate waste. Remember what we talked about? Malnutrition? Well, guess what? What if your lining where you absorb nutrients is damaged? What happens then? If you can't absorb nutrition, even if you're eating it, then you're going to end up with malnutrition. So, secretes water and ions, reabsorbs water and nutrients, produces mucus, and protects against infection. People that have autoimmune diseases are also more susceptible to infection because their lining is damaged. And the lining is there to keep everything where it's supposed to go. Here we have a graphic representation of where it exists in the kidneys. It's the digestive lining, or also the lining of most organs. So yeah, super important. You don't want this to go bad. But it gets attacked by those CD4 ninjas in your blood ninjas. Hold on. Here we go. Look. Monk, ninja. Okay, so you got blood ninjas and they're attacking stuff. Here we go. Th17. This regulates all inflammatory mediated non-infectious diseases, things like multiple sclerosis, psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, irritable bowel disease, Crohn's, systemic vasculitis, autoimmune myocarditis, lupus, autoimmune encephalomyelitis. Easy enough to say. Periodontitis, so of the gums. Neuronal damage via neuroinflammation that leads to depression. Oh, wait a second. Hold on. Depression. Did we just say depression? Let's look. Chronic stress, poor sleep, PTSD. Those all cause the piñata to bust open, which then activate your ninja cells to go out, and then they also can cause depression, stroke. So you see how it becomes cyclic. If you feel bad, then you feel bad, and then you feel bad. Sometimes it's neurological, it's neuropsychiatric, sometimes it's chemically mediated, and sometimes it's immune mediated. That's why this stuff is important to pay close attention to, because it is complex. All right, and then also it can cause infertility and a unexplained recurrent spontaneous abortion. That's where ladies have a hard time getting pregnant because of their immune system. I've personally worked on cases like this. It's very sad, and doing the right stuff, I've had really good success helping people have their babies. All right, so once the fire starts, I took a small portion of this and I expanded on it. If you notice, this is a loop. We're going to start up here. Once the autoantibodies are circulating, it creates an immune complex that then tells the photographer guy to send out more mug shots. The male guy takes those mug shots, circulates them around, and back to the immune complex over and over and over. So if you notice, this is a self-contained loop. It requires no external output, no external input. It just goes. So once you start the fire, it continues to burn all on its own. All right, and if you notice, there's another loop that happens. Turns out your immune system's kind of loopy. Anyway, so here, once the cell dies, it wakes up these receptors, fires up the sirens, blood ninjas, they go out, and then they start this whole cell damage, tissue damage, inflammatory cycle. Okay. So this important component is really, really necessary to look at. So I'm going to slow down just a touch because we're going to dive. This is going to make a lot of sense later on because you're going to ask the question, how does that matter? Why is it that one little piece makes such a big difference? And this is exactly, I spent a lot of time on this slide. First off, to understand what it actually meant. But this is one of those key pieces I was looking for, and here you go. So, NOD-like receptors. These are nucleotide binding oligomerization, So NOD receptors, like I said, vocabulary is super important, but the concepts are even more important. These are intracellular. These are on the cells. These are sensors of pathogen association molecule patterns, PAMPs and DAMPs. What you need to understand here is molecular patterns. Molecular patterns. That's pathogen associated and damage associated. So if there's an infection, it'll activate these. If there's cell damage, it'll activate these. But these are molecular pattern receptors. These look for patterns. Now that's important because all amino acids form patterns of proteins. And depending on what the protein is, your body will recognize that pattern, and that's what allows to have crosstalk. All right, these are found everywhere. They're found in lymphocytes, macrophages, those dendritic cells that we talked about that are involved, that get attacked by Th17, yes. Also non-immune cells in the epithelium. So these are in the epithelium. These are in all those layers, the skin, the gut, the sinuses, all of your respiratory organs, your reproductive organs. That's where all this stuff is. And these are the cells that notice a pattern and they fire off all those alarm chemicals to then activate your blood ninjas to go out and start attacking everything. The problem is if the signal they give is based off of a molecular pattern that is you or something you eat or something you need, your blood ninjas are going to go out and start attacking everything. We're calling them blood ninjas from today forward. Okay, here we go. Okay, so patterns, these are pathogen-associated molecular patterns. This right here, if you notice, it has this shape because that's how the proteins stick together, okay? That is a lipopolysaccharide. If you remember, here we go, back, oh, forward. This one, right here, LPS. Lipopolysaccharide, part of the toxicant. This is a toxic chemical. It's like quills on a porcupine. And when that thing stabs into your tissue, those receptors recognize the pattern and they start attacking things that look like that. This one chemical right here, this one protein pattern, is associated with alcoholic hepatitis. So alcoholic, meaning alcohol-induced hepatitis, is actually induced by an infection because that's what releases those proteins. Damage to the fallopian tubes, intestinal permeability, SIBO, obesity and insulin resistance. So if you've had enough bacteria for long enough, it actually can make it so you can't lose weight. And then also they trigger and regulate autoimmune disease. Now, biomimicry. One of these is a viceroy and one of these is a monarch. One of them is poisonous and one of them is not. If you were a bird, you wouldn't know which one of these to eat. This is exactly what happens with your cells. So when we go back to these and your pattern recognition molecules have to look at two things that look identical, they don't know which is which. So what do? Either they just leave it ride and then it causes continuous damage, and that's typically what causes your DNA to replicate in a toxic, hostile environment, which eventually degrades to cancer long term, or it does nothing. And then, so that's if it does nothing. If it does a lot of things, then what ends up happening is you attack everything, and that's eventually what autoimmune disease is. So, back to this. See how the puzzle comes together? Add those back in. There we go. Let's take a breath. Ah, puppies. Oh, kittens and flowers. See, it's interesting. All three of these things are allergenic. Yeah. So, science and specific examples behind them. The effects of digestion and digestibility and allergenicity of food. Basically, what this slide says is if you don't digest your food, you will become allergic to it. And here's exactly how it happens. Down here, digestion of proteins is hampered when pH increases. When your stomach acid is not very acidic, then you don't digest well. And when it's not digested well, you end up with bigger fragments. Bigger fragments of what? Proteins. And they are recognized by the immune system. How are they recognized by the immune system? Those molecular recognition patterns, so PAMPs and DAMPs. And that leads to an increased risk for sensitization for allergic reactions. Here's a fancy chart. If you look down here, the bigger proteins stay back and the smaller proteins move forward. These are gradients. If you notice over here, they're all lined up at the top. This is at a pH of 5, the protein is stable. pH of 2, very acidic, broken down. All these fragment out, that means these are digested. This is digestion right here. not how well what you eat gets chewed. It's how well your acid breaks it down. Chewing is important, don't get me wrong, but it's not the ultimate measure. It's how stable the proteins are, and that has to happen with a high acid environment. So if you're not digesting your food, they're not breaking down, they're not moving through the system. All right, so here's a study that was done. Peanuts and soybean allergens had a 100 or 10-fold reduction in their allergy-inducing potential if conditions mimicking human digestion were achieved. Now, human digestion is a broad category. Ideally, that means you'd be digesting it completely. Most people don't digest their food well, and they end up with some kind of allergenicity. Now, they did the same thing 10 years later using codfish as a model, and they found that that had a 10,000-fold reduction in its allergy-inducing capacity because of proper digestion. Moving on. There we go. Interference with gastrointestinal digestion was confirmed to play a major role in development of food allergy. Right there. Okay. The first study, here's where we start to dig into that a little further. First study of 152 adult patients being treated for 3 months with either an H2 receptor or proton pump inhibitor due to dyspeptic disorders such as reflux, gastritis, erosions, or gastric ulcers. So what is that saying? For 3 months, these people took a medication that would decrease their their hydrochloric acid, their stomach acid. For why? They took it for problems associated with poor digestion. What happened? They were screened for a boost of specific IgE reactivity, allergenicity, and either it was a boost in something they were already allergic to, or they developed a new allergy in 1/4 of all patients after just 3 months. 1/4 of all patients had an increase or a new incidence of allergy reaction to food. There was a study that was done with 792,000 children, demonstrated a high allergy risk being treated with antibiotics or acid suppressive medication for the first 6 months of life. Antibiotics can cause lifelong allergies and asthma if it's done in the first 6 months. Same thing with acid suppressive, but people get that. Like, if you understand you need acid, but you also need probiotics. The antibiotics completely change your gut microbiome. All right, antacid medication of the mother. If you're pregnant, this applies to you. If you plan on being pregnant, this also applies to you. If you know somebody who is pregnant or planning on being pregnant, this applies to you. All right, antacid medication of the mother leads to an enhanced risk of asthma or allergy in the offspring. Meta-analysis confirmed the risk of associated with intake of this medication during pregnancy for the development of allergenic diseases for children later in life. That means if a female who is pregnant takes antacids, their child has an increased risk. Why? Because where did that child's immune system come from? The mother. Okay. Surgical elimination of the gastric digestion by Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Gastric bypass surgery increases food sensitization. Now, here's an interesting thing. They did skin prick test, which is pretty common, right? Revealed an increase of positive reactions indicating sensitizations towards tested food and aeroallergens in 77.8 and 88.9% of the patients. Now, the thing that really hits home for me is if you don't have a stomach, in this case, they had it removed or bypassed, but even if your stomach doesn't work as a stomach should, it increases your risk for allergies both in food and airborne. If you don't have a stomach or a functioning stomach, you have a higher risk for developing airborne allergies. So yes, your gastric digestion affects your asthmatic and sinus allergies. Here you go. Why? Epithelium, where does it go? From your nostrils all the way through. You're a tube inside of a tube, from the nostrils all the way to the other end. Okay? This study indicates an increase in allergy risk for gastric bypass patients, as well as anybody else that doesn't have a functioning stomach. Okay, adjuvants. I was told this is a bit of a spicy topic, but it's in the research, so I'm just reporting on it. Here we go. Adjuvants were found to inflict by themselves. An adjuvant is what's used in an injection, typically used in vaccines, to create an immune response so the body finds the proteins and the complements that are associated with diseases, and then it knows to attack them. But if you just put them in by themselves, sometimes it doesn't work. So they throw things in there to stir up the system. The problem is, in some people, And this is where there's a bunch of debate and discussion because it's not in all people, but some people, their genetics don't work the same way as other people's. That's why we're all a little different. It can actually cause a long-term problem. And it's by themselves an illness of an autoimmune nature defined as adjuvant diseases. So just that. One of the contentions I have is sometimes when they're doing studies to see if an injection is safe, they'll compare it to an empty injection, which just has the adjuvants in it. And they say they're the similar outcomes. But that's not comparing it to an actual empty injection because the adjuvants can actually cause the same disease, whether it's with or without the proteins. So I think that's it's a bit of a trouble. So there's a question of silicone as an adjuvant as it pertains to connective tissue diseases. That's something that's been shown in literature pretty consistently, as well as Gulf War syndrome and macrophagic myofasciitis, which followed multiple injections of an aluminum-based vaccine. Sorry, I'm really excited. I want to get through this. I'm stumbling across some more of my words. Here we go. All right. There are adverse effects asserted by the adjuvants. There is no doubt that safer adjuvants need to be developed. I completely agree. I think that there is a world where if we have safer ways to provoke the immune system that doesn't leave long-term consequences, it will help to incorporate into future vaccines that we can keep the world disease-free. We need safe and non-toxic adjuvants. Like that's a very important component here because I don't think we should make people sick trying to keep them healthy. Okay, autoimmunity and heavy metals. Chemical exposure can trigger or accelerate development of autoimmune manifestations. Now, here's where the science gets a little blurry. If they think that some people are just naturally predisposed to it, we don't know if the chemical exposure caused it or if the person would have eventually ended up there anyway. But if you think about it, we have all these toxic environment issues. So whether if it's something that's applied by science or by the environment, we could say that that person may have developed that disease anyway. But it can absolutely trigger something that wasn't there or accelerate something that is there. Although heavy metals are elementary chemical structures, meaning they're found all around nature, they have profound and complex effects on the immune system. That means they're hard to understand. They do things that is completely unexpected. And that is one of the things that is very regularly and routinely seen in the science. Okay, in the airwaves, this is about the electromagnetic waves. They tend to suppress the immune system. Murine, this was done in a mouse model. So murine talks about mice. Here we go. VDR pathway exhibits susceptibility to electrosmog. Remember this. VDR pathway. This is vitamin D receptor pathway. It's on all of your immune cells. All of your immune cells and the lining of your gut and a bunch of other cells in your whole body, they have a vitamin D receptor because vitamin D is a hormone and it is used to regulate up and down various functions of your immune system. But that pathway shows a susceptibility to electrosmog. This was demonstrated in laboratory settings. By the way, it's beautiful, isn't it? So this is the vitamin D receptor. All those proteins, they fold and unfold, and they have to move into positions to connect like a lock and key, and they are susceptible to changing shape, kind of like when you cook an egg and the white part, or sorry, the clear part turns white. That's basically what happens here. All right, so characteristic models of instability lie in the microwave frequency range. So they're saying electricity in the air or electromagnetic waves. But which waves? Which frequency? And it says basically that it's the cell phone and Wi-Fi signals that are really the ones that cause the susceptibility. So that means these are found naturally in our normal environment, in a house and as well as in the office. Okay, there's a scientist, Bies, he reported in 1978 that human EEG was changed by wave amplitudes as low as negative 100 dBm with negative 60 dBm giving multiple subjects immediate frontal headaches. Now, here's the crazy part. Sadly, such levels are impossible to replicate in 2016, which is when this study was done, without the use of a Faraday cage, which is basically a cage that blocks out all of the signals, because in cities, the background electrosmog rarely falls below negative 50, which is 100 times more more potent than the negative 100 signals used in the original study we see here. So what this is saying is this study that was done demonstrated changes in brainwave frequencies and causing an immediate frontal headache. And we are living in a world where it's 100,000 times stronger just on our day-to-day basis. All right, autoimmune patients seem to have a predisposition to electrosmog hypersensitivity at levels currently existing in the typical home and work environments. Yikes. Okay, a series of 64 patient-reported outcomes subsequent to the use of silver-threaded cap. So silver-threaded cap is basically a Faraday cage that you can wear on your head. And bottom line is 90% reported a definite or strong change in their disease symptoms. So the people that are affected by this, there is a way to treat it, and basically it's blocking out the electrosmog. So this is basically where we left off. Now you're caught up. Leaky gut syndrome is often described as an increase in permeability of the intestinal mucosa. We're talking about autoimmunity as a gut feeling, which could allow bacteria, toxic digestive metabolites, bacterial toxins, like a lipopolysaccharide that is known to induce autoimmune troubles? Yes. And small molecules. It allows all that stuff to leak into the bloodstream. You know what else happens in the bloodstream? Circulating immune system turns your meditating monk cells into blood ninjas, and they start attacking things. And that's with the gut leaking. And now you're all caught up. Here we go, part 2. So this I found to be fascinating. Why haven't we heard about this? Why is this not common? Well, it's pretty easy. If you look, so what I did is I did at the National Library of Medicine, leaky gut. I did a search. Now, if we go down here, there is from 1973 to 2021, you can see where all of these studies have been done in just the past few years. And it hasn't made it into mainstream conversations across the medical world. It sometimes takes a little while for that to happen. But this very clearly demonstrates when the research has been done, and it's very, very recent. We're learning more about the body and the immune system every single day, and this gives us a very clear understanding of our knowledge base is rapidly growing in this. It's something to pay attention to. And it's also part of the reason why your doctor may not have talked to you about it yet. Okay, so nervous system involvement with celiac disease is known to occur even at subclinical levels. So your nervous system, brain, spinal cord, stress, those kind of things. And it happens with celiac disease even at subclinical levels. That means it's something you won't notice. I heard a statistic somewhere in the range of 84% of the people diagnosed with celiac disease did not know they had it. So most people that have celiacs don't know they have it. There's a mini review focused on the possible neurophysiological basis of leaky gut, leaky brain disease. This was a huge research project that was done. And the microbiota's contribution to inflammation, gastrointestinal, and blood-brain barrier integrity. Now, let's take a moment to unpack this. So, neurophysiological. That means there is brain controlling your physiology. Basis of the leaky gut, leaky brain disease. And the microbiota, these are the bacteria, these are your probiotics, these are the bacteria that live inside, and their contribution to inflammation, gastrointestinal distress, and blood-brain barrier integrity. So gastrointestinal integrity and the BBB, blood-brain barrier, are very, very similar. We know that those are epithelial, and when one becomes inflamed, the other can also become inflamed. So instances where somebody has a head trauma and it causes inflammation of the epithelium of the brain, it can also cause inflammation of the epithelium in the gut. And vice versa. If somebody has a really bad gut reaction, they can also end up with an inflammatory brain disease. So there was a study that was done on that. Microbes can control the integral segments of our neurobiology and even affect several mammalian systems linked to the brain and digestive system. So there's a bunch of studies, those lipopolysaccharides, there's a bunch of studies where they looked at those and other chemicals created in the gut, such as serotonin, dopamine, and those and things of the like. And they showed that it controlled the way that your nerves functioned. So this is not just digestive issues. This is now brain regulatory issues. Things like blood pressure, heart rate, sudoriferous glands, digestion, mental state, brain fog, memory issues, all manner of things. And they link the brain and the digestive system together, and it involves microbes. If you remember back that one slide, we talked about how antibiotics with a child below the age of 6 months can affect their long-term digestive health as well as allergies and autoimmunities. That's one of the things that's saying here is you need those microbes to control your neurobiology for the brain and digestive system. Okay, the microbiota gut is an integral component of the gut-brain neuroendocrine metabolic axis. What? Let's break that down. Gut, brain, neuroendocrine. Endocrine is your hormones. It's the hormonal system, which the neurological system and the endocrine system share chemistry. So that's an important component. Metabolic. How well does your metabolism run? That can be on a bunch of different things. One of the areas that I've seen this impact people a lot is if somebody gets ill while they're on a weight loss program, their body shuts off their weight loss and focuses more on cleaning out the infection. Which means some people with weight loss resistance, and we've seen that, can have an absolute impact directly on their weight loss by their immune system. Gut, brain, neuroendocrine, metabolic axis. Axis is a fun word that we like to use in physiology that says that it is a system where, again, where we talked about those loops. This here specifically covers a bunch of those things together all in one giant loop, where the gut, brain, neuroendocrine, and metabolic systems all have this interplay that is measurable and it's well understood. And any disruption that can occur, such as antibiotic use during disease, could upset the homeostasis and share an inflammatory component. That means, and here's the thing, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm not saying that you should not use antibiotics if they will save your life. What I'm saying is it would behoove you to make sure that you stay as healthy as possible and do whatever you can to make sure that you don't need to use antibiotics, because that can disrupt not only short-term but long-term this entire axis of how your digestion, your brain, your neuroendocrine system, and metabolic systems all work. All of those can be significantly impacted by the use of antibiotics. Now, here's the other thing I see often. Somebody will go in for a suspected pneumonia. They're told it's viral, and then they're given an antibiotic. Now, that's not my area of expertise, so I don't know for sure why they do that. But from what I can tell, that could lead to further problems, especially further on down the line, because the inflammatory system greatly affects the epithelial cells, which then also lead to further susceptibility for immune system troubles. Microbes can control integral segments of our neurobiology. Did I just do that one? Okay, there we go. So stressors such as glycooxidative stress, diabetes, prolonged hyperglycemia, and obesity are risk factors for gut-blood barrier disruption. What do you think this right here is? Glycooxidative stress. Glyco meaning sugar, oxidative meaning damage, cell damage. So those are your pro-oxidants, your inflammatory components. Diabetes, prolonged hyperglycemia. What is that? Anybody know? Hyperglycemia is high blood sugar. Prolonged for a long period of time. How do you keep your blood sugar high for a long period of time? Stress. Constantly snacking, especially on high glycemic foods. There's what's called the glycemic roller coaster, also nicknamed the Sysvic cycle. We'll talk about that in another slide, but basically what happens is you eat a bunch of sugar, your blood sugar rises up, your body releases insulin, it brings it down, and then it releases a beta wave of insulin to bring it down even farther. So then there's the correction, and then there's the overcorrection, which then causes you to crash, have low blood sugar, and then you want to eat a bunch of stuff, and that drives it back up. Caffeine and sugar makes this bad because it causes a chronic inflammation, which then causes your body to release more cortisol. Then you drop your insulin, and then, or you use up your blood sugar, then you go through the cycle over and over and over and over again, which then eventually leads to obesity. If you have too much sugar for too long, it can lead to diabetes and obesity, which then can also disrupt the gut-blood barrier. That's leaky gut. That's one of the ways that it happens. So even if I've had people where they were eating a bunch of inflammatory foods, they went off of them. It happens a lot of times with patients when they figure out if they are celiac or if they are gluten sensitive, because they're not digesting those proteins properly, gluten and gliadin. They don't digest them well, so they're like, oh, I'm going to take those out of my diet. And we talked about it last time. If you don't digest well, you create an allergy, autoimmunity to those things that you don't digest well. So if you wanted to give yourself an allergy to something, just eat way too much of it all the time and make sure that you stay inflamed, and then your body eventually will start to recognize those sequences, those patterns as bad, and start to attack them. And you'll develop first a sensitivity, then an allergy, then it can even lead to an autoimmunity. So sometimes people jump out of one frying pan into another frying pan. So I've had people where they'll stop eating gluten, but then they'll replace all of those starches with different starches, whether it's potato starch or rice, and that's just as glycemic. In fact, in several of the gluten-free books, they talk about how if you go from one starch to another starch without the proteins, then you're going to have a higher glycemic impact, and it's going to lead to chronic hyperglycemia, which then opens up the blood, the gut-blood barrier. You get all those extra things that transfer over that shouldn't be there. The barrier's there for a reason. Detection of alterations in the gut microbiota and intestinal permeability in patients with Hashimoto's. Ooh, what's Hashimoto's? Hashimoto thyroiditis. Now, this is a study that was done looking at people with changes in their gut flora and leaky gut. So intestinal permeability is leaky gut. Gut microbiota is your biome, your probiotic. And they looked at that with people that had Hashimoto thyroiditis. That's an autoimmune thyroiditis, which, by the way, is 90% of thyroid issues are autoimmune. Here's a fun fact. A full 1/3 of your thyroid hormones are recycled in your gut. So if you have a lot of gut inflammation and you're putting those hormones, which are proteins, into your gut, your immune system will eventually find those and recognize the pattern and start to attack it elsewhere in the body. Where do you think that might show up? I'll give you a small hint. Thyroiditis. Okay. Hashimoto thyroiditis is the most common autoimmune disease worldwide, characterized by chronic inflammation and circulating antibodies against the thyroid, against thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin. Those are, one's an enzyme, as you can tell by the ACE, the peroxidase is an enzyme. Globulin is a blood component. Both of these things circulate in your blood. They're proteins. They have a specific pattern that is recognized by your immune system. If you have these things, which you need to have these things, in a highly inflammatory environment all the time, it is possible that one could create antibodies against them, which is exactly what we're talking about here with Hashis. It's the most common autoimmune disease worldwide. And the way that we help to fix that is by fixing, healing, and sealing the gut. And if there's a neurological component involved, we fix that as well. And sometimes it's recoverable depending on how long it's been there and how broken down a person's body is. The microbiota modulation of the diet directly influences the inflammatory profile. Here we're still talking about leaky gut. So let's look here. Microbiota, what is that? Those are your probiotics, modulation. So the changing of the microbiota by the diet. What you eat matters. How well you digest it also matters. Directly influences the inflammatory profile. So what I think is very interesting thing here is, look, your inflammatory profile, which is the end result, has two components, diet and microbiota. So if you eat a perfect diet, but you've had your microbiota altered through antibiotics or severe illness and disease, you could eat really, really well and still have a bad inflammatory profile. Structure times function equals quality of life. This is a common theme that we see. So your diet is what you're adding to it. That's your day-to-day choices. Your microbiota is sort of the machinery that you have in your gut. That causes a long-term issue with your inflammatory profile. So careful what you eat. Okay, there's a lot of evidence that intestinal dysbiosis, bacterial overgrowth, and increased intestinal permeability favor the Hashimoto's thyroiditis development, and thyroid-gut axis has been proposed. This is exactly what we just talked about. Your thyroid recycles proteins in the gut, and if you have Bacterial overgrowth. We talked about bacteria releasing those inflammatory components that activate your immune system. Intestinal dysbiosis. They favor the development of Hashimoto's. That means we know that it's toxic. We know that it's damaging. We know that it's something that we can measure clinically. And it pushes a stress on your thyroid. It stresses your immune system. And sometimes that stress is enough to lead to pathology breakdown, and sometimes it's not. But it does favor that. So these people have an increased risk of developing Hashimoto's thyroiditis because of intestinal dysbiosis. That means having bad gut flora. And we talked about the reasons why that can happen. Bacterial overgrowth. We know why that's a problem. And increased intestinal permeability. So the more there's going on down here, the more likely it is to show up in the rest of the system. All right. Microbiota modulation by diet directly influences the inflammatory profile and this we talked about this, but here's why. By changing the flora and has a direct or indirect action on immune cells in the gut mucosa. Those are the linings. Okay? Moving right. Oh. This is a little brain break right here. That's why I put a blank slide in there. Intentionally left blank. So, quick recap. Because we covered a lot of physiology. The thing that you should take away from all of this is your immune system is there to clean up damage, either toxic damage or mechanical damage. The trouble is, if you don't eat well, if you have had exposure to digestive suppressants, if you've had exposure to infections or even antibiotics, even if they were properly treated, if you don't reestablish proper gut flora and get the nutrition that you need, it's going to cause a breakdown in your body's ability to regulate what it attacks and what it doesn't. And once that fire starts, it goes and goes and goes and goes until it gets shut off, which is not an easy thing to do. We do it for people, but it's not the easiest. Okay, let's talk about vitamin D. Have you heard? There was a study done, 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. That's the active form of vitamin D, D3. It ameliorates Th17. Ameliorates is a fancy word that says it takes care of it. It cleans it up. It eliminates Th17. You remember we talked about Th17 way long ago? It's probably like an hour at this point. But that Th17 is the thing that it aggravates and attacks and mediates all autoimmune diseases. So vitamin D interacts in a positive, healthy way to shut down and diminish all autoimmune diseases. Now, is that going to be enough? Not necessarily, but it does the job we're looking for it to do. How does it do it? Transcriptional modulation of interleukin 17A. Okay, so basically what it does is it makes it so that your body stops making this chemical that causes that inflammatory response. And this is a simplified version of the conversation, but basically what it does is it doesn't just go around and soak it up. What it does is it makes it so that your cells stop sending out those signals. It helps to stop those inflammatory signals. So interleukin 17A plays a critical role in numerous inflammatory conditions and autoimmune diseases. So vitamin D shuts it down, and it takes and tunes down the body's production of this inflammatory chemical. The active form of vitamin D has a direct repressive effect on IL-17A in human T cells. Remember, those are your blood ninjas, by the way. When they get activated, they start going around chopping everything up. Those are your blood ninjas. Your vitamin D shuts those down. That's how you fix it. I had somebody comment after my last presentation, was like, great, I understand why I'm dying. How do I stop myself from falling apart? I said, we'll get to that. Here you go. Vitamin D plays a huge role in that by direct repressive effect on the expression of that chemical in your T cells. There you go. Vitamin D showed a repressive effect on T cells in the periphery and, wait a second, central nervous system. Periphery meaning not just gut, okay? So if you have an inflammatory disease that starts in the gut and goes into the blood, it goes to the periphery, that means non-intestinal. That means other organs in your body, chronic liver stuff, kidneys, bladder, reproductive system, lungs, heart, spleen, pancreas. All of these areas can be affected by autoimmune disease, and vitamin D helps to downregulate all of them. And even in your brain and central nervous system, There was a study that was done, I'm not sure if it's in this pack of slides or if it's going to be in the next one, but basically what it describes is when you have all of this inflammation going on, it sensitizes your central nervous system to perceive pain more exaggerated because of the inflammation. Inflammation makes you hurt worse even if there's no physical damage. Things like fibromyalgia, chronic pain syndrome, CRPS. There's all these weird myofasciitis. There's these inflammatory pain cascades that don't show really any tissue damage other than mild inflammation. And yet it causes those nerves to be sensitive. They hurt a lot worse than they should. And vitamin D can help with that in the periphery and the central nervous system. It decreases it by 260%. Boom! All right. Okay, mechanism of vitamin D was found to be transcriptional repressive mediated by the vitamin D receptor. Oh, wait, there's our friend, the VDR. You remember what impacts the VDR? We talked about that a little while ago. We talked about electrosmog, how it changes those protein structures so that thing doesn't work right. Now, here's the interesting thing. Central nervous system, VDR. The VDR, remember one of the things that happened because of electrosmog, it gave people a headache. Where does your central nervous system live? In your head. Okay. That's it for today. That was a big running start. Next time, we're going to follow up on so many more things. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Stay tuned. It just keeps getting better.